clients just don't understand the risk involved in this so-called free insurance proposition. So I'm going to dispel these ridiculous propositions today. If you can't tell, I'm kind of fired up about this because these types of programs, these types of firms out there that are selling this proposition, I think they ruin it for the premium financing folks that are doing this the responsible way, the right way, the honorable way. And so what I'm going to do today is go over one of these free insurance propositions that an advisor put on my desk because their client was being pitched this ridiculous proposition. Hey guys, Darren Sugiyama here, CEO and founder of Lionsmark Capital, the most transparent premium financing intermediary firm in the life insurance industry. So on today's webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about this ridiculous concept that has plagued the premium financing industry for the last several years. And it's this whole free insurance proposition wherein the client is told that they don't have to pay anything into the premium financing program. It's about as stupid as buying a house and the mortgage lender telling you, oh, you don't have to pay your mortgage payments. Just roll up all the mortgage payments back into the loan and just compound all that debt. Don't worry, your house will appreciate in value. So when it comes time to sell it, even though you're a gazillion dollars in debt now, don't worry because you'll sell the house for more than that gazillion dollar debt accrual. No one in their right mind would do that when thinking about buying a house. Yet there are so many programs out there right now where these ridiculous propositions are being sold to clients, where clients just don't understand the risk involved in this so-called free insurance proposition. I've heard this ridiculous proposition be disguised with all these different types of terminologies, legacy capital preservation, cashless transactions, zero out of pocket, margin loans against deposits. I mean, all this fancy language, and it all comes down to one thing. The proposition to the client is go ahead and borrow tens of millions of dollars, post a bazillion dollars of collateral, and don't worry because the policy value growth will outpace the debt compound growth. And in theory, that could happen, but it could also not happen. And if that doesn't happen in a short duration period, maybe in the first 10 to 15 years, that policy could be so upside down, meaning that the debt balance could be greater than the policy value. And the client is going to have to post more and more and more collateral to the point where, in some cases, the client runs out of liquidity. They run out of collateral to post. And even if they do have a ton of liquidity, the problem is that in these propositions that I've seen that have come across my desk, nowhere in that proposal does it really show the client what the real risks are. So I'm going to dispel these ridiculous propositions today. If you can't tell, I'm kind of fired up about this because these types of programs, these types of firms out there that are selling this proposition, I think they ruin it for the premium financing folks that are doing this the responsible way, the right way, the honorable way. And so what I'm going to do today is go over one of these free insurance propositions that an advisor put on my desk because their client was being pitched this ridiculous proposition. So I'm going to go through their actual numbers. I reformatted it because I'm not going to put a competitive firm on blast. I'm not going to call out any premium financing firm's name that are out there doing these egregiously, overly aggressive, overly leveraged type of propositions. But I am going to be very transparent, very truthful about what's wrong with these concepts. So again, you're going to see a real live case that came across my desk literally 2 weeks ago. And I'm going to break down everything that's wrong with this ridiculously stupid premium financing program that tells the client they don't have to pay anything. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so this is a real life client that was brought to me just a couple of weeks ago. And the advisor shared with me the proposal that a competitive premium financing intermediary showed the client, wherein their proposition was don't pay anything into the program. You're going to get free insurance. And so I'm going to talk about the hidden evils of this ridiculous free insurance proposition that I see out there in the premium financing marketplace. This particular client was 50 years old, preferred non-tobacco, male, and I was told that the client was going to need $20 million in face amount for starters. So this is essentially the numbers that I took out of the competitor's proposal and reformatted them just to make it generic. Again, I don't like putting competitors on blast. I don't think it's my place to do it. I don't think that's a classy thing to do. but I am an ambassador of the truth. And so we're going to get to the truth here. So I just extracted these numbers out of that competitor's premium financing proposal. Here's what it looks like. They are proposing that the client borrow just over $1.5 million in annual premium over a period of 15 years, which is kind of an odd premium schedule in my opinion. So a 15 pay. And they show the ongoing loan balance lasting all the way out until the beginning of the 30th year, which is a very long debt window. I would never design a premium financing policy like this. I think it's very strange. That's a huge amount of time to have that premium financing loan in place. You're talking 3 decades of debt for the client there. And as you can see here, they conveniently dropped the borrowing rate down from level 6% down to 5.5% in year 6, then down to 5% in year 7, 4.5%, then 4.35% from years 9 all the way through year 29. So I think 4.3% is being a little aggressive and a little optimistic. Could borrowing rates come down to 4.35%? Sure. In theory, they could. And if they do, then this little magic trick that this premium financing shop put together, the magic trick will actually work under these conditions. So what they're telling the client is that they don't have to pay anything into this premium financing solution here. They're showing the client accrue the interest due for the first 15 years. So nothing out of pocket for the client. That debt just continues to compound and compound for the first 15 years. And then starting in year 16, and they do this from year 16 all the way through 29, they're actually showing the client take participating loans from the policy to service the interest due to the third-party premium financing lender. In my opinion, this is a big no-no. You're starting to cannibalize the policy cash value to service the third-party interest. So I'm going to guess that the justification for doing this, that the other premium financing shop will try to sell the client on, is, oh, hey, don't worry, because your index credit is going to be greater than the $1.4 million annual drawdowns here that you're going to pull out of the policy to service the loan. And that may be true in a carrier illustration where you're receiving a positive index credit every year. But what about reality, right? What about a real world scenario where you're going to get some years wherein the index credit is going to be less than the borrowing rate, and in some years you're going to hit 0 index credits in an IUL. So in a year where you get a 0 index credit in the IUL, your cash value doesn't stay level with no decreases whatsoever. Your cash surrender value is going to decrease in the amount of the policy charges. So again, when you're looking solely at a carrier illustration that shows a positive static return every single year, that just so happens to conveniently be greater than the borrowing rate, well, yeah, you have positive arbitrage into perpetuity. So in this particular policy, as I peeled back the layers of the onion, the policy index credit was being illustrated at 6.35%. And so the borrowing rate was conveniently 200 basis points less at 4.35%. So yeah, if you have a 200 basis point positive arbitrage into perpetuity, of course the math works. But again, that's not the way the real world works. So again, in this case here, they're going to draw down $1.4 million between year 16 and year 29 from the policy to service the interest payments with a third-party lender. And then in the 30th year, they're showing the client pull out $33.5 million, almost $33.6 million from the policy value to pay off the loan. So again, that's year 30. So again, the magic trick works, assuming that the borrowing rate goes down to 4.35% and assuming that the policy never hits any zeros. It continues to just punch out a 6.35% return every year. So if this works, yippee, the insurance is free, right? The question I have is, well, what if the borrowing rate does not decrease to those borrowing rates that they're illustrating there? So I tested this just to see what would happen if the borrowing rates did decrease, but didn't decrease this much. So in this scenario, for the first 5 years, I kept the borrowing rate at 6%. Then from year 6 to 10, I dropped the borrowing rate to 5.5%. And then in year 11, I dropped the borrowing rate down to 5.2%. So 5.2% is the average prime rate over the most recent 20-year period. So if you go back last year, 2025, roll the clock back 20 years. If you look at the prime rates, the average prime rate over that 20-year period was 5.20%. And under these borrowing rate scenarios here, the client, in order to pay off the lender, would have to stroke a check in the amount of $9.975 million just to get out of this deal and have the policy still in force. And that's if the borrowing rate only goes down to 5.2%. And then I ran another scenario where we see, again, the borrowing rate staying level at 6% for the first 5 years, and then the borrowing rate just dropping to 5.5% all the way out. If the borrowing rate only drops down to 5.5%, that client is going to have to write a check for almost $13.3 million, writing that check to the lender to pay off the premium financing loan, in addition to pulling down that $33 million from the policy value. Again, this is just to keep this policy in force and have it do what it was illustrated to do. So the so-called free insurance was not free under these two different scenarios. Again, if the borrowing rate only goes down to 5.2%, the so-called free insurance program costs $9.97 million. If the borrowing rate only goes down to 5.5%, the so-called free insurance program costs $13.3 million. And that's a far cry from so-called free.
Says free! I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, it's not. It's
Gets
gross.
the people going.
So the irritating thing about this, the problems I see here, is that in the premium financing proposal that I saw from that competitive premium financing firm, there was a severe lack of disclosure, right? They didn't talk about interest rate volatility the way I just showed here, right? I mean, do you think in their proposal they showed the so-called free insurance program potentially costing this client over $13 million? Of course they didn't. And again, I saw the full proposal. Nowhere in there did it talk about this level of liquidity requirement the client would have to come up with under these borrowing rate scenarios. So the potential out-of-pocket expense for the client was never really discussed. The other thing that they didn't talk about was the additional collateral calls or the collateral requirements that the client would have to post in the event that the borrowing rate was greater than 4.35%, as they showed in their proposal. So the so-called free insurance program, not so free, is it? But it gets even worse than that, because under these scenarios where the client would have to cut a check for $9.9 million or $13.3 million, those amounts that the client would have to come up with assume that the policy received a positive index credit every year. So if the policy did not receive a positive index credit every year, which it never will because of market volatility, index volatility, I'm going to show you what happens when there is volatility in the market. Some of you guys know we developed a proprietary backtesting software platform where we can actually simulate what the cash value might have looked like with all of that volatility, with caps and floors and charges, etc. We built a proxy, a synthetic proxy for the IUL product, again, to model what the potential cash value would have looked like when there is index volatility. The other thing our model shows is what happens when there's a poor sequence of returns. In our backtesting platform, we actually analyze 121 different actual historical 40-year runs or rolling 40-year periods so we can see what happens under different market conditions. The 40-year period that produced the worst compounded annual growth rate had a terrible sequence of returns. In fact, in the first 10 years of that rolling 40-year period, the S&P 500 produced 4 negative returns in the first 10 years. And so in an IUL, with using a 0% floor, that policy would have produced 0 index returns in 4 of the first 10 years in that sequence. So we're going to take a look at that. And I like to look at the 40-year period that produced the worst compound annual growth rate, that 40-year period that I just talked about. So here it is. This is the time frame during this 40-year period. It started on October 1st, 1971, and rolled forward 40 years. As you see there in the column where it says gross index return, those were the S&P 500 historical returns during that 40-year period, not including S&P dividends. And so with this particular product that the competitor used, it had a 0% floor and a 10% cap. So that column right there shows what the index credit would have been, assuming that 0% floor and that 10% cap. Now, one of my least favorite words in the financial space is the word average. And I'll explain why I hate talking about average returns, because average returns can be very misleading when it comes to what the actual outcome might be with all that volatility. So if we look at the raw S&P 500 returns compared to the index returns, assuming the 0% floor and the 10% cap, the average return during the first 10 years of the sequence, again, there were 4 negative S&P returns during that first 10-year period, the average return would have been 3.85% during that 10-year period. If we apply a 0% floor and a 10% cap to that same 10-year period with those same S&P returns, the average return is up to 5.28%. So that really speaks to the power of that 0% floor in an IUL product. But it's not quite this simple. If we look at the 29-year period that this competitor is showing in terms of the debt window, the raw S&P 500 returns were 8.02%. So even with a poor sequence of returns for the first 10 years, the market did rebound, and the average returns over that 29-year period at 8.02% is pretty darn good. If we apply the floor and the cap to that 29-year period, the average return would have been 6.20%, which is still pretty darn good in light of the terrible sequence of returns during the first 10 years. Now, if we look at the average borrowing rate that this competitor showed in their proposal, during that 29-year period, their average borrowing rate was 4.70%. Again, if you remember, they started out showing a 6% borrowing rate, and then it decreased down to a 4.35% borrowing rate. But the average borrowing rate over that 29-year debt window that they're showing was 4.70%. Again, I think that's a little aggressive, a little optimistic, but we're going to go ahead and use that assumption. So if we look at the positive arbitrage between the average returns here and the average borrowing rate, it's pretty good, right? You have a 1.5% positive arbitrage between the historical S&P correlated floor and cap returns at 6.2% and the average borrowing rate at 4.7%. So a 1.5% positive arbitrage during this worst 40-year period that I am backtesting here, that sounds pretty good, right? That should work, right? Right? Wrong. It does not work. The average borrowing rates and the average returns can really mislead someone to believe something is going to work that really doesn't work. And the reason is because instead of looking at average returns, we need to look at actual returns. We need to take into consideration a poor sequence of returns and how that can really put the overall proposition behind the eight ball, right? If those returns are really poor in the first, say, 10 years in this scenario here. So let's take a look at what happens here under this scenario with all this volatility. If we look at this graph here, I think this is really indicative. The solid black line represents the as illustrated net death benefit in the carrier illustration, assuming all of these competitors' assumptions with the borrowing rate and the index crediting rate, et cetera, et cetera. The green dotted line represents the as illustrated net cash value. The dashed purple line represents the simulated cash value in our proxy when we backtested the best producing 40-year period out of those 121 different 40-year periods that we analyzed. However, look at the dotted purple line. That represents the simulated cash value during the worst 40-year period out of those 121 different periods that we analyzed. Now, again, the scary thing here is if we look at the average returns over that period of time, the first 29 years, the average return was 6.20%. And the average borrowing rate was 4.70%. That's a pretty good scenario when we look at average numbers. But when we look at actual numbers, this is scary as all get up. And this is the hidden secret, the hidden dirty little secret, the hidden dirty little secret problem that exists when you don't have the ability to backtest these pie in the sky, overly optimistic premium financing programs. That's why at Lionsmark Capital, we are so adamant about doing this right. Full transparency, proper client education. So I looked at this program and said, this is not the way to do this. So the client and the advisor asked me, Darren, how would you do this your way? And I said, you mean, how do you do this properly? They said, yeah. So I said, okay, in this scenario, right, this 50-year-old client, if you look at their current net worth and their future estate tax liability for a generation two, let's say life expectancy is age 85, their future estate tax liability is going to be about $32 million at age 85. Again, we're going to assume that is a realistic life expectancy. So here's how we calculate this. This is an estate tax calculator that we built here, where up top here, we input the client's current age. We input the client's life expectancy age. If they want to see something less than age 85 or later than age 85, again, these are just manual inputs. So under these assumptions here, we're going to calculate what that estate tax liability is going to be based on the client's current net worth of $27 million. And we're going to input a net worth annual growth rate assumption. So we put in here 4% to be very conservative. I think most people think their net worth is going to grow at somewhere between 6 or 7%. But in this case, we're being very conservative here, and we're assuming a 4% annual growth rate. We're also going to input the estate tax exemption limit right now for a married couple is just over $30 million, and the current estate tax rate is 40%. So we're going to project that $27 million estate value right now, growing at a rate of 4%, all the way up to life expectancy at age 85. We're going to back out the $30 million estate tax exemption, and then we're going to tax the remaining amount at 40%. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner there, what that shows is that $27 million estate is going to grow to a value of about $110 million. We back out the $30 million estate tax exemption, and Generation 2 is going to owe about $32 million in estate taxes. What I like about using this simple calculator here is it shows the client from a mathematical standpoint what that future estate tax liability might look like based on certain assumptions. So it's not me telling them that they need to buy, $32 million of life insurance. It's showing them, look, this is what the estate tax calculator says. If you want to change some of the inputs, we can certainly do that. You want to show a lower growth rate assumption, you want to show a sooner life expectancy age, we can certainly do that. But under this scenario here, the client agreed that these were reasonable assumptions. And so here's how we built this here. In this particular premium financing loan model, we have the client borrowing $1.5 million in annual premium on a 10-pay, and we are showing them actually pay the interest out of pocket. Imagine that. No free insurance here. Actually pay the interest due the way you're supposed to. In this scenario here, the client is going to have to post some collateral, peak collateral, meaning the most collateral that the client would have to post under these circumstances. Again, 5.2% borrowing rate and a little over 6.5% crediting rate. Client would have to post just shy of $1.5 million. In this loan design here, we're paying off the loan in year 11. And if we design the policy properly and efficiently, we design the loan model efficiently, the idea of getting out of the loan after a 10-year debt window is really attractive to a client. The other thing too is it saves the client another 4, 5, 6 years of paying interest payments, which can get a little expensive at that point. Now we also transparently show the client what happens if the borrowing rate is higher than 5.20%. Again, 5.20% is kind of our default, and that is the average prime rate over the most recent 20-year period. We also want to show them what happens if the borrowing rate is 100 basis points higher and then 200 basis points higher. So over on the right-hand side of the screen there, we're showing them the interest payments due, assuming a 5.2% borrowing rate, a 6.2% borrowing rate, and a 7.2% borrowing rate, just so that they can see, based on the interest rate environment, they may be paying a little bit more or a little bit less in any given year based on borrowing rates. And I think it's really important to document the fact that we showed the client these different scenarios in the client proposal, because we never want a client to come back and say, oh, yeah, they tricked me into doing this because they promised that the borrowing rate was going to be this forever and ever and ever. No, in the proposal, we're showing 3 different borrowing rate assumptions, which would require 3 different client outlays. So again, very important from a compliance and a transparency standpoint. As you see down here at age 85, in policy year 36, the policy net death benefit is just over $32 million, which is what the estate tax calculator projected that the client's Generation 2 would need to come up with to pay those estate taxes. So there's a lot of custom design that goes into these policies and these premium financing loan models here at Lionsmark Capital. We essentially calculate what the need is going to be in the future and then back into where we should start so we finish with that right number at life expectancy. Okay, so we also backtest these designs here using our proprietary backtesting software. Some of you probably have heard us talk about Breadbox before. Breadbox is what we call our backtesting software. So again, we analyze 121 different actual historical 40-year periods of S&P 500 performance. And I personally like to use the worst producing 40-year period as the benchmark. And so here it is again. This is using our loan model, not our competitor's loan model. Again, we're starting on October 1st, 1971. Those are the actual S&P 500 returns. And then with this particular policy, this has a 0% floor, an 11% cap, and also has a multiplier bonus feature with an associated asset-based charge, which our backtesting software can accommodate for. So we can actually see what might have happened using actual policy designs, including some of those variable charges. So in this column right here, that is what the policy would have generated in terms of index credits during those backtested years. When we look at it on a graph here, this is really encouraging. And again, this is partly based on the insurance carrier and the chassis that their IUL product was built on. And it's also a reflection of how we at Lionsmark Capital custom design that policy. If we look at the as illustrated carrier death benefit that shows up in the carrier illustration, that's that black solid line there. And the green dotted line, again, just like the other graph we looked at, that is the as illustrated policy cash surrender value that we see in the carrier illustration. If we compare the best 40-year period and the worst 40-year period that we analyze in our Breadbox backtesting software, up top there, the purple dashed line is the simulated cash value in our synthetic proxy during the best 40-year period. But what's really impressive here is look at the worst 40-year period. The worst 40-year period severely outproduced the as illustrated cash surrender value, illustrating it in this case at 6.84% static return. This is what I'm looking for when I analyze products from different carriers. And I'll tell you, of all the carriers and all the IUL products that I have analyzed using our backtesting software, some of them actually perform better during times of volatility than that static positive return every year. And some, it's just the opposite. Some products illustrate beautifully when you get a positive index credit every year. But as soon as you mix in some volatility and a poor sequence of returns, all of a sudden, those policy constructs really crash and burn. That's why it's so important to work with a premium financing intermediary that not only understands the loan side of things, but is also a product technician. And though this may sound self-serving, unless they have the ability to backtest these policies with volatility, and all they show is average returns and simulated borrowing rates, you really don't know whether or not that premium financing proposition is going to work over time. With Lionsmark Capital, we're the only premium financing intermediary in the entire life insurance industry that has the ability to show this type of backtest modeling that I'm showing here. In addition, during the best 40-year period that we're looking at on the screen here, I actually ramped up the borrowing rate to 7.2% as opposed to 5.2%. So again, when we talk to the client about all the different variables, I think it's really important that the client understands what those variables are, what the risks are, how we mitigate those risks, and incredibly importantly, how we document the fact that we discussed all of these different variables with the client. So in future years, it would be very difficult for a client to ever come back and accuse us of not fully transparently educating them as far as how this actually works. Okay, so I hope this opened your eyes to the risks that are involved in irresponsibly designed premium financing programs. Premium financing as a concept is a wonderful tool for the right client to use under the right circumstances, designed in a way where the client fully understands all the moving parts, all the variables. And it drives me crazy because I've heard so many people in the premium financing space say, oh, we use the KISS method, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And my response to that is, listen, there is nothing simple about premium financing, stupid. This is a sophisticated construction for a very wealthy, very liquid client that understands the power of leverage. Most of these clients have used leverage to expand their wealth, whether it be in a real estate portfolio or expanding a business. And so using leverage in purchasing a large premium finance life insurance policy makes sense if they understand how leverage actually works, right? Responsible leverage is not mortgage everything to the hilt and pay nothing and let the debt just compound and hope that the asset growth outpaces the debt growth. That's insane. That's like going back to the year 2006 and investing in a huge real estate portfolio using a negative amortization mortgage loan. Look what happened. People literally lost their fortunes. It financially ruined people's lives because they didn't understand the risks. And that's what I feel one of my missions is in my particular area of specialty, premium finance life insurance, is to really help the client understand what it is that they're doing, how it works, why it works, when it works, and also when it doesn't work. So again, if you use premium financing responsibly, the way we do at Lionsmark Capital, it's a wonderful, intelligent, prudent way for a wealthy client to acquire a large life insurance policy. But it must be done right, it must be done responsibly, and client education must be paramount. So I'm going to get off my soapbox and stop preaching here. But again, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this because it's very, very serious. And I take this very, very serious. One of my responsibilities, I guess, in my role is to protect the client as well as protecting the advisor who doesn't live in the premium financing space on a day-to-day basis. You might be very smart, you might be very talented, might be very successful, might have a phenomenally successful life insurance practice. But if you're not living in the premium financing space on a day-to-day basis the way I do, you just don't know what you don't know. So please, please, I beg you, help me help you, to take a line from Jerry Maguire, right? Allow me to protect you. Allow me to protect your client. Let's do this right. And let's, as simple as it may sound, just do the right thing. Hope you guys enjoyed this webinar. Talk to you soon.